Warning.
F-Zero, released in 1990 for the Super Nintendo, became the template for every subsequent racing game on console in the 90s, as well as the definitive futuristic racing series. Super Mario Kart, released 2 years later on SNES, created the kart racing subgenre with its random power-ups littered across the tracks. Now imagine what would happen if the racing of F-Zero was blended with the power-ups of Mario Kart and was set in a true 3D space. Well, there's no need to imagine because it's real. But Nintendo didn't make it. Rather, it was made by a scrappy British studio with the backing from Nintendo's newest rival at the time, Sony. Ahoy there! I used to hate weapons-based racing games for some reason. Maybe it's because I thought it detracted from the overall racing experience. But it took me until this decade to realize how similar weapons racers are to Mario Kart. Because of my irrational dislike for the subgenre and bias towards F-Zero, I missed out on other great racing games. While I was in the back corner playing both Mario Kart and F-Zero, I was living in blissful ignorance of Sony's equivalent, Wipeout. I didn't start playing games in that series until this year, 2024, when I tried out every N64 racing game. The thing is, the Wipeout series has been around since the beginning of the PlayStation. Since we're about 24 years away from when the prequel to the first game took place, now is a better time than ever to discuss the zero-gravity racing series that took on F-Zero, while also discussing its developer Psygnosis, aka Studio Liverpool, how each game looks, feels, and plays, and why we may never see a proper Wipeout ever again. The Liverpudlian development studio known as Psygnosis made a name for themselves like any upstart British game developer in the 80s and 90s, making games for the Amiga, Atari ST, ZX Spectrum, and all the associated British microcomputers of the time. However, the 1990s saw developers growing infatuated with a third dimension, with a popular pseudo-3D game in 1990's F-Zero, and a true 3D polygonal arcade game with 1991's Starblade. By 1993, Psygnosis were acquired by Sony in preparation for their upcoming PlayStation and its quest for world domination. The extra financial backing from Sony really allowed the developers to spread their wings. Development on Wipeout began in the second half of 1994 and took about 14 months to develop. During development, a non-playable CG version of this game appeared in the cult classic film Hackers, which premiered in theaters less than 2 weeks from the launch of the PS1 in Europe, and less than a week after the console's North American launch. Yes, I've never heard of this film until now, but this movie and Wipeout are connected in more ways than the one sequence, which I'll get to in a bit. Wipeout launched with the PlayStation in Europe on September 29, 1995 to widespread critical acclaim, and a bit of controversy. An infamous ad campaign created by Sheffield-based The Designers Republic featured two people with nosebleeds, with Wipeout being marketed as a dangerous game. The ad itself remains a product of the 90s, and because of accusations of drug misuse implied in the ad, it should stay that way. However, the ad helped set the tone for the series. It was intended for a more angst-filled, edgy, club-going crowd, with the music playing a huge part in the game's aesthetic. Electronic music was the sound of the future through the lens of the 90s, and the music from Tin Wright, aka Cold Storage, fit the game like a glove. The PAL release also featured additional licensed tracks from other UK electronic acts, like the Chemical Brothers, Left Field, and Orbital. Funnily enough, there were songs from all three of the aforementioned artists used in the film Hackers. Sadly, this is where we hit our first snag, since most of the music in the series will trigger Content ID, especially the works of Cold Storage. That means I can't sample any of it, so go look up each game's soundtracks when you're done watching. The vibe of the first Wipeout is great, I just wish it played as good as it looked. Don't get me wrong, it's not broken, but the physics of the first game, and the rest of the series for that matter, are weird. Each hovercraft feels slippery, like you're sliding on ice or sledding down a hill. People like to call this kind of game death sled racing. The triggers act as air brakes for each rudder to help with cornering, but you're going to have to come to terms with drifting around corners. The gameplay of the original Wipeout hasn't aged all that well, but this was one area where Psygnosis would step in to refine it. And then some. Wipeout XL came out 2 years later, also known as Wipeout 2097 in PAL regions. It took everything from the previous game and made it better. The handling, while still slippery, is much more responsive, and the visual style is more detailed. But I think there's a reason why it was called XL. It feels like a modest upgrade to the original game. It's more Ridge Racer Revolution than Rage Racer. That said, I enjoyed playing this game more compared to the original. The first game left me a bit frustrated in how loose it felt. The soundtrack is once again the standout, with Firestarter by The Prodigy being the headliner. Cold Storage, Orbital, and the Chemical Brothers return, with welcome additions from Underworld, The Future Sound of London, and Fluke. Worth noting that while Psygnosis were a subsidiary of Sony, they were able to release their games on other platforms. The original game got a PC port, and XL was ported to both PC and Sega Saturn. The Saturn conversion was handled by Tantalus, who developed racing games in this era, like South Park Rally, and would develop the HD remaster of Twilight Princess for Nintendo. They didn't turn out so bad after all. Speaking of other platforms, Wipeout made its only appearance on a Nintendo console in 1998 with Wipeout 64. This one's kinda interesting. It looks and sounds mostly like XL, but has different music partly because of cartridge limitations. Cold Storage did not compose music for this game, with the task being handed off to Rob Lord and Mark Bandola, credited as PC music in-game. Fluke and Propellerheads contributed to the soundtrack, but this game's soundtrack is the least evocative of the Psygnosis era of Wipeout. While this game does play as well as XL, it faced stiff competition from F-Zero X on the console. F-Zero X had only come out a couple weeks prior to Wipeout 64, but it made Wipeout look weak because of the smooth 60 frames per second of X. And it's no contest when comparing soundtracks. F-Zero X had better music, it's just objective fact. I personally think of this game as an incremental upgrade to XL, which itself is an incremental upgrade of the original game. Not much has changed. Fortunately, we wouldn't have to wait long for things to change. The next year, in 1999, Psygnosis released what might be considered the pinnacle of the series, at least in the PS1 era. Wipeout 3. Released exclusively for the PlayStation, this felt like a proper sequel than an update. Psygnosis had definitely learned a few tricks on PS1 because this is the best looking game in the original trilogy. Tracks were more detailed and had a higher draw distance. The presentation was top-notch with the perfect kind of Y2K futurism we've come to expect from the designer's Republic. It had a widescreen mode that wasn't heavily distorted. This game's style rules. I didn't think the handling could get any more responsive without eschewing its death sled physics, but it's tuned to perfection. And on top of everything, it has a fantastic selection of electronic music. Sadly, Cold Storage was no longer involved in the series, in fact, he left Psygnosis in 1997, but Sony and Psygnosis made a great decision to put DJ Sasha in charge of the music. He contributed 5 original tracks to the game, as well as include his seminal track, Expander. The Chemical Brothers, Orbital, Propellerheads, and Underworld return alongside the addition of Paul Van Dyke and MKL. It's an excellent soundtrack and deserves a listen. Seriously, when you're done watching, look up the soundtrack on YouTube and make sweet love to it. I consider Wipeout 3 to be the peak of the series, at least on the original PlayStation. Wipeout 64 may have been my introduction to this whole mess, but Wipeout 3 sold me on the series. It stands in the upper echelon of PS1 racing games alongside Gran Turismo 2 and Ridge Racer Type 4. It's that good. we get to the year 2000, though, change was in the air. The PlayStation 2 came out, getting a one-year head start on its competition and burying the Sega Dreamcast. And in a move that wasn't out of the ordinary, Sony consolidated the offices of Psygnosis and completed the studio's transformation. Gone was the old Psygnosis and its owl, and in came Studio Liverpool. No more would the studio publish games on other consoles. They were now exclusively making games for PlayStation systems. In addition, Studio Liverpool were now exclusively a racing game developer, with Formula 1 2001 being the first game under the studio's new name. But it wouldn't be long before they took another crack at anti-gravity racing, though. Studio Liverpool released their first Wipeout game under the new brand, Wipeout Fusion, in 2002, but oddly was not published by Sony in North America. BAM Entertainment published the game due to a hiccup in Sony Computer Entertainment America getting the publishing license. You could be forgiven in thinking Fusion was a budget title, seeing as BAM published crappy licensed games up to that point, and that's a damn shame. Fusion does not look or feel like a budget title, and is in fact a good game to play, albeit a slightly disappointing game. Common complaints of the time centered around the graphics, which looked dated even for an early PS2 game. I honestly don't think it looks that bad, but it does look like a generic sci-fi racer at times. If you showed me a screenshot of both this and Extreme G3, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference. But what Fusion lacked in visuals or innovation, it made up for with the addition of Zone Mode. This takes the Death Sled concept and ramps it up to 11. You're constantly accelerating, trying to see how many laps you can complete before your machine gets too fast to control. And that machine has no brakes. It's a fun diversion. One point of praise was the soundtrack yet again, but I didn't grow attached to any of the songs. Sure, they fit the game, it is a Wipeout game, but nothing really stood out to me. Doesn't help that there's no easily accessible way to listen to the music in-game. Not a big problem in the age of the internet, so at least give this game's soundtrack a listen to see if you like it. Studio Liverpool felt like they had dropped the ball with Fusion, so the team went back to basics with Wipeout Pure, released in 2005 as a launch title for the PSP in North America and Europe. This is more like it. It's a proper continuation of Wipeout with its icy controls that are easy to learn but difficult to master. And it looks pretty damn good for an early PSP game, though it does suffer from frame rate fluctuations. The music really started reaching into the depths of electronic with artists like Aphex Twin and Tiesto, though overall it doesn't get my thumbs up. Pure was pioneering for its time since it's an earlier example of games with downloadable content, or DLC. New courses, songs, and ships could be purchased, to which there were a lot of music packs. It doesn't really matter in this day and age since none of it can be downloaded anymore, but it was a warning sign of things to come for the games industry. Then Studio Liverpool made a follow-up that was even better. Wipeout Pulse came out in 2007 for PSP, but it also got a port to PS2 in PAL regions. I'll be showing the PSP version because why does 50Hz even exist in the first place? I personally think the music in Pulse is better overall than Pure with the presence of Aphex Twin, DJ Fresh, Noisia, and friggin' Kraftwerk. If that's not your thing, the game supports custom soundtracks. However, I think electronic music has been well ingrained in the series and nothing else really fits. Pulse plays more like a refined version of Pure with improved visuals and new tracks, but critics were split on the difficulty and repetition. Incremental upgrades were a recurring theme with Wipeout, and the final console entry in the series would be no different. Or would it? Wipeout HD and its expansion Fury came out over the next 2 years after the release of Pulse. Unfortunately, I can't form any definitive opinions on this game since I don't own a working PS3, and I can't find a way to run the game on RPCS3 since it was digital download only in North America. And no, I won't show the version in Omega Collection yet. But from the footage I've seen of this game, it was a real technical marvel in 2008. For the sake of context, the PlayStation 3 proved notoriously difficult to develop for, thanks to the complexity of the Cell processor. While the PS3 had a lot of graphical potential for the time, few developers could realize it early on. Fortunately, Studio Liverpool was one of those few who could tap into it. Wipeout HD was committed to running at 1080p and 60 frames per second, being one of the small handful of games on PS3 to reach that target. For the most part, it succeeded, despite some screen tearing and use of dynamic resolution scaling. But in motion, though, you're not likely to notice it. What you will notice are the tracks, more specifically the lack of new ones. HD reuses most content from Pure and Pulse, including most of the songs. New music was added in the Fury expansion, including a standalone pack of new music from Cold Storage. Also added in Fury was in-game advertising during loading. Not only did people hate in-game ads, but it effectively doubled loading times since you had to sit through an ad even though the game data was already loaded. This was quickly patched out, but it was yet another bad omen for the future of gaming. Despite being digital only in the US, the European release of HD Fury was available physically. Sure, I could have played it on RPCS3 since the PS3 wasn't region locked, but sometimes games were. While the guts of HD were good, it seemed like the Wipeout series was in a stagnant state. Studio Liverpool were also losing out on development opportunities. Sony had bowed out of Formula 1 games with 2007's Formula 1 Championship Edition, which had been developed by Studio Liverpool, leaving the studio with only the Wipeout series. For the developer formerly known as Psygnosis, the writing was on the wall. Studio Liverpool would have one last crack of the Wipeout series in early 2012, with the release of Wipeout 2048 to coincide with the launch of the PlayStation Vita handheld. Again, I can't demonstrate this because I don't own a Vita or a PlayStation TV, and a Vita emulation is not ready for prime time. 2048 served as a prequel to the original game, which was set in the year 2052. As such, the game looks less slick than prior entries and more grounded. For the most part, you're racing on realistic roads as opposed to metallic and futuristic track bits. I like this aesthetic, but sadly it runs at half the frame rate of the previous games. That said, the original games on PS1 ran at 30 FPS. It still looks playable. The soundtrack is another good fit, featuring artists like the Chemical Brothers, Kraftwerk, Deadmau5, The Prodigy, as well as one of my new favorite songs in Change of Direction by Anile. As a nod to the original PlayStation games, it includes a few remixes of tracks from Underworld, Orbital, and The Future Sound of London. But the general consensus from fans is that the original songs were better. The game's biggest issue had to be the loading times. While it seemed acceptable for a console game, this was a handheld game in a time where mobile gaming was booming. This game would not work as a quick fix. Studio Liverpool had made a valiant attempt, and 2048 sold fairly well, but in the end, it was too late.
Contender Eliminated.
In August of 2012, just a handful of months after the release of 2048, Sony announced they were shutting down Studio Liverpool. The longtime steward of the Wipeout franchise was gone. Around the time of the studio's closure, the team were working on 2 launch titles for the upcoming PS4, one of which was a Wipeout game set to be dramatically different from previous titles. But this never saw the light of day, and the Wipeout series would lay dormant alongside its Nintendo rival F-Zero. Until the remaster trend started to kick in. In a surprising move, Sony announced a remaster of 2048 and HD Fury for PlayStation 4 called Wipeout Omega Collection. This was the first game in the series not to be handled by Studio Liverpool following their closure. I actually played this once back in 2021 through 1 month's slate of PS Plus games, and never played it again since I don't claim ownership of a PS4 in my house. In hindsight, what the hell was I doing? Omega Collection to me looks more like a remake running on the same game engine than a remaster, but the upgrades to the graphics are great. Both games now run in HD at 60 FPS with additional touches like motion blur and HDR lighting. This game is beautiful to look at in motion. While the original graphical styles of each game are preserved, the soundtracks unfortunately have not. It does continue the series standard of electronic music, but features new licensed tracks from the likes of The Chemical Brothers, Red One, The Prodigy, Metric, Noisia, and more. I just wish there was an option to listen to the original soundtracks of each game. Nonetheless, I would say Omega Collection is the best way to experience 2048 and HD Fury today since it can be played on both PS4 and PS5. There was also a PlayStation VR mode added post-launch for what it's worth. Even though Omega Collection sold well in its first week, it seemed like a bittersweet send-off to Wipeout. In the latter half of the 2010s, Sony stopped showing interest in racing games that weren't Gran Turismo. Drive Club, a promising contender in the simcade space, launched to tepid reception and never got a sequel before being delisted in 2019. MotorStorm, a series of arcade racers, died out after 2011. And Wipeout was another casualty in Sony's portfolio consolidation.
Canon. New lap record. Canon.
But Wipeout wasn't done yet. What came next would be the nail in the coffin. Mobile games, where good games go to die a swift capitalist death. While there are a good handful of mobile games out there, most of them are simple to a fault and stuffed to the gills with microtransactions. I abandoned that minefield long ago. And as it turns out, Sony would put the Wipeout series out to pasture by handing off the name to a publisher called Rogue Games. Soft launching in 2021 as Wipeout Rush, we enter Wipeout Merge as it came to be known in 2022. It's not a racing game, but actually a racing management game in a similar vein to other popular racing management games. I had no idea this existed, and as it turns out, no one else did either. But I'm neither able nor willing to play this because the game's been delisted for over a year now. From the limited footage that exists of this game, it's more of an idling game mixed with a doubler game like 2048. So I guess you could also call this Wipeout 2048? Huh? But it looks like a Wipeout game that looks worse than the PSP games, and it's riddled with microtransactions and ads. Yep, it's a mobile game. Since I don't play mobile games anymore, I've been able to set aside my irrational hatred for these kinds of games and replace it with rational hatred. Merge is, or was, a Wipeout game in name only. Sony should be ashamed of whoring out the series to a mobile game developer and effectively burying the franchise.
Pilot ground increased.
At this point, Wipeout has been left behind with no one giving so much as a passing glance to Merge. Omega Collection really felt like the last chance the series had, and to me, it feels like Sony thought it didn't meet expectations. There hasn't been a proper Wipeout game since 2017, a new game since 2012, and a new console game since 2008. Not to mention the fact that HD and HD Fury will be gone forever when the PS3 store closes. Would I trust Sony to bring the series back for PS5? Hell no! How can I trust a company that forces an online requirement for single-player games on PC? How can I trust a company that charges $699 for a high-end console? How can I trust a company that remasters games that don't need it? and then delist the original game for said remaster and force an online requirement for a single-player game on PC. Ugh. I'm sorry. I don't think Sony deserves to bring back Wipeout. As long as Gran Turismo exists, that's all the racing games Sony needs. But it's clear that people are still hankering for some classic, futuristic anti-gravity racing. While F-Zero 99 got people's attention in hopes of bringing that back, it's not F-Zero I think of for a continuation of the subgenre. The games I think of that keep the dream alive are games like Redout. The Redout series from 34 Big Things takes inspiration from the future racing games of yesteryear, including F-Zero, Pod, Roll Cage, and yes, Wipeout. Redout takes its name from the effect where negative G-forces cause blood to rush to the head as opposed to a grayout or a blackout. To that extent, ships in these games control more like aircraft since you need to account for pitching and strafing. Here we're looking at the 2022 sequel, Redout 2. Having never played a Redout game until now, the handling model took me by surprise. Gravity does play a factor in races, and tracks will constantly make you account for yaw, pitch, and roll in nanoseconds. Wipeout definitely influenced this game from its similar title, hovercraft, and selection of electronic music. They were able to get a song from Giorgio Moroder in Redout 2. The style of the game, at least during races, also borrow from Wipeout while featuring speeds similar to F-Zero. If anything, the game feels more like an evolution of F-Zero GX with its loop-the-loops, lack of weapons, and breakneck speeds. As a game, my first impressions with Redout 2 are a mixed bag. Unreal Engine can produce some good-looking games and really helps with the sense of speed, but somehow has a fuzzy, grainy look to it. I think the flight controls are an interesting twist to the anti-gravity racing formula, but I'm not liking the course design. Most of it relies on track memorization and blind jumps. A lot of blind jumps. I didn't feel like I was playing a successor to Wipeout, rather I felt like I was playing a new F-Zero. The original game had power-ups, but the second game doesn't. As such, I can't confidently call Redout 2 a spiritual sequel to Wipeout, but it's pretty much all the anti-gravity racing subgenre has left. Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Ballistic NG. If anything, Ballistic NG is much more of a tribute to Wipeout than Redout was, with a little bit of Jet Moto thrown in for good effect. I don't have this on PC, but judging by its screenshots and footage, I can easily mistake this for an old-school Wipeout. From its unmistakable boost and item pads to its PS1-inspired graphics to its electronic soundtrack, this is the kind of death sled racing that's been neglected in recent years. There's even an option for a PS1-like wobble effect as a nod to how PS1 games wobbled. Since it's a PC game, there's an active modding scene with tons of vehicles and tracks available. So of course that means someone's ported ships and tracks from the PS1 Wipeout games to this game. And would you believe me if I said the game was developed by 2 people? My money's on Ballistic NG for keeping the Wipeout dream going, and it's something I might check out in the future. I mean definitely before 2052. I never realized how much I liked the Wipeout series until recently, and it pains me that the series went out on a sour note. As an F-Zero fan, I didn't want to see another hovercraft racer lay dormant, but that's where we are now. Wipeout was an event. It was an electronic music festival disguised as a futuristic racing game that borrowed from Mario Kart. It was stylish and edgy, but it feels like it went as soon as it came, unable to recapture the moments from its past. Given Sony's current priorities involving PSN, unnecessary remakes, and overpriced consoles, we may never see a true sequel to Wipeout ever again. But there will always be someone out there keeping the anti-grav dream alive. We'll never forget the works of Psygnosis and Studio Liverpool. They're the fire starters. Twisted Fire Starters. What are your thoughts about Wipeout? And what were your favorite songs from the games? Let me know. Until next time, you're the Fire Starters. Twisted Fire Starters. Squiddy the Kid signing off. Like, comment, subscribe, and all that electronic music, because come on, this is still Wipeout.
Gold medal awarded.